If you're taking good care of your pet poison dart frogs, chances are high that you will eventually find a clutch of eggs from them. For me, that first happened during a lunch break from online school back in early 2021, and since then I've been able to breed 5 different dart frog species and raised around 150 froglets in total. Today's video will be a complete comprehensive guide to dart frog breeding for beginners, covering how to care for the eggs, tadpoles and froglets. I will try my best to cover all the details and the things I wish I would have known when I started out. I hope you enjoy it. Dart frogs reproduce in a way that's very different from most other frogs, so in case you're not very familiar with them, I'm going to give you a brief general overview of the whole process before complicating it any further. But trust me, if you stick around I will complicate it. Dart frogs will usually lay their eggs in moist areas on land, for example on leaves and in leaf litter. They have external fertilization, and after the eggs are laid, the male will keep them humid if necessary by regularly returning to them with a humid belly. Compared to other amphibians, the clutches are relatively small, with anywhere from 2 to 40 eggs in each clutch depending on the species. The eggs hatch after roughly 2 weeks, and in the wild, one of the parent frogs would pick up and transport the tadpoles to individual or communal small water sources, usually in the water-filled leaf axils of these plants called bromeliads. For most species, the parental care ends here, but for a few species, the females will actually keep feeding their tadpoles with infertile feeder eggs. In captivity, we let some species take care of their tadpoles in the vivarium, but most of the time, we take out the eggs and raise the tadpoles ourselves in individual cups or communal bins to make sure to get a steady food supply. After a while, the tadpoles will grow back legs, and at the same time, front legs will develop underneath the skin. Those fully developed front legs will actually just pop out overnight after some time. Once the front legs have appeared, the tadpole will usually absorb its own tail and leave the water to become a froglet within a few days. The whole process from egg to froglet takes a few months, and the exact time varies a bit depending on the species and temperature. As I promised, now it's time to complicate things. Some of you might have heard about how poison dart frogs will transport their tadpoles and take care of them by feeding them with infertile feeder eggs. However, different dart frogs show different levels of parental care, and there's a lot of confusion surrounding this. So to clear things up, I'm going to sort some of the most common dart frog species into a few categories based on their breeding behavior to get an easy overview of the different dart frogs in the hobby. You most likely only keep frogs from one of these categories, so you can just ignore what I say about the others. First, we have the so-called obligate egg feeders, which include all the frogs from the Ophaga genus. These frogs take great care of their tadpoles by transporting them to individual water sources and feeding them with infertile feeder eggs until they become froglets. In fact, these tadpoles can only eat these feeder eggs, and they can't be fed with any other food. If you keep any obligates and you're looking to breed them, it's best to let the tadpoles be raised by the parent animals in the vivarium without interfering too much. This video won't focus on the obligate egg feeders at all, as I've not kept any of them myself. You might still find some useful tips and tricks in this video, but ignore the whole part where I tell you to take out the tadpoles and feed them with fish food, because that simply won't work with any Ophagas. Next up, we have the non-obligate egg feeders. Just like the obligate egg feeders, the female will feed their tadpoles with infertile feeder eggs. However, these tadpoles can also eat a wider variety of food items instead of only eating feeder eggs. These non-obligate egg feeders consist of a few species from the Ranitomea genus, including Ranitomea imitator, Vanzolini, Cyrensis, and Flavovitada. It's a very common misconception that all Ranitomea species feed their tadpoles with feeder eggs, but the truth is that many of them don't. For these non-obligate egg feeders, you can choose between letting the parent animals take care of everything in the vivarium, or taking out the eggs and raising the tadpoles yourself, just like I will show you in the video. If you let the parents do the work, you'll get to witness a very interesting behavior, and there's less work for you, but if you take the tadpoles out and raise them artificially, you would probably get a higher number of froglets in total, since the parents can only take care of a limited number of tadpoles at a time. There are also some quote-unquote fake egg feeders too, and you can pause to read this if you want to learn more, but I won't really count them as their own category, so let's just continue. All other dart frogs don't feed their tadpoles at all. They will still move the freshly hatched tadpoles to individual or sometimes communal water sources, but then the tadpoles are left to fend for themselves. In captivity, we usually take out the eggs from these species and raise the tadpoles ourselves to make sure they get a steady food supply, since they usually wouldn't get that if they're left in the vivarium. Sometimes a few tadpoles might survive in the vivarium by eating algae and drowned fruit flies, but that's quite rare and those froglets normally aren't very strong. Within these other non-egg feeding dart frogs, I also want to make a distinction between ones that can easily be raised in groups and the ones that are cannibalistic. Basically, the tadpoles from all the Epipedobedes and Phyllobedes species are widely known to be very communal, and the same goes for some other genera that you don't really see in the hobby that frequently, such as Amarega and Allobedes. In the wild, these species lay relatively large clutches, carry a large number of tadpoles on the back all at once, and deposit all their tadpoles together in a single large water source. You can keep the tadpoles from these species together in relatively small tubs without any issues, and you can even mix tadpoles of different ages to some extent. I always keep these species communally, and I don't see a reason to keep them separately, since that would be more work. However, most other popular dart frogs in the hobby, such as all the Dendrobedes and Ranitomea species, lay smaller clutches and their tadpoles are cannibalistic to some extent. I usually raise my tadpoles from these species individually. It's possible to keep these ones communally too, but it requires a far bigger tub and results in occasional losses. I will talk more about these different kinds of setups once we get to the tadpole care. With all of that cleared up, it's time to talk about how to get your dart frogs to start laying eggs. Of course, step number 1 is to have a pair or a group of frogs that are a suitable age. Usually they can start breeding when they're somewhere around 10 to 14 months old, but the males will usually start calling significantly earlier than that. The absolute limit where they can start reproducing at the earliest is probably much younger, but I wouldn't want to stress about breeding them as early as possible, since young frog parents often lay bad clutches in the beginning, and breeding can take quite a big toll on animals that aren't completely mature. However, if your frogs are well into adulthood, but you're still not getting any eggs from them, then there are certain tips and tricks that you can implement to get them going. But once again, if they're just young or new, don't stress about it. First, you can try to have a dry season followed up by a wet season to get them going. For some frogs, such as my Dendrobedes leucomelas sciana banded, this is almost a necessity for them to lay eggs, but even for other species it can be a useful tip if they're just a bit stubborn. Frogs that always live under perfect conditions might not be very willing to breed in captivity, and in the wild, many dart frogs do experience a dry season at some point in the year. I usually do a month or two when I simply mist less and let it all dry out slightly more than I usually would between mistings. I also slightly decrease the amount of food they get during this time. Then, after a month or two, I start misting it heavily and feeding them a lot, and this usually results in eggs very fast. It can also help to switch out the male or the female or change something around in the group configuration. Sometimes a certain pair just isn't compatible, and sometimes you would have a better chance to get eggs if you were to pick out a pair and put them by themselves instead of keeping a huge group. Another reason for why pairs are sometimes better than groups is the fact that females of some species might try to eat each other's eggs. Similarly, rehousing them to another vivarium or changing something up can sometimes also trigger them to breed. Sometimes they're simply not feeling it in a certain vivarium. That doesn't have to be because you're doing something inherently wrong or taking poor care of them, but upgrading them to a bigger vivarium or even just a different vivarium of the same size can have a positive effect. You can also experiment a bit with different kinds of egg laying sites placed in different areas of the vivarium, which I will talk about in the next segment of the video. But regardless of how stressed you might be about it, sometimes a certain pair or group will just simply decide to not produce any eggs for a while, and that's completely normal. Patience is the key, and you should definitely give them plenty of time before resorting to transferring them to a different tank or switching out their partners. In fact, I would be more concerned if they constantly bred, because that takes quite a big toll on the breeding animals. I know a few people who actively make their frogs stop breeding for a few months of the year, by separating males and females or something along those lines. My frogs usually take a break on their own accords for a few months every now and then, but if yours don't, then separating males and females or exposing them to a dry season to give them a break could be a good idea. If you're still watching, it would mean the world to me if you could consider subscribing and giving the video a like, because I spend a lot of time making these videos. Subscribing is completely free and it's a great way for you to support the channel. While you're at it, make sure to also press the notification bell so you won't miss out on any future uploads. I make plenty of videos similar to this one covering various aspects of dart frog keeping in great detail. The places dart frogs lay their eggs in vary a bit from species to species, and sometimes from pair to pair. In general, most poison dart frogs lay their eggs on humid surfaces, but not submerged underwater. In our vivariums, we usually provide them with artificial egg-laying sites, such as petri dishes and film canisters, so the eggs will be easy to find. If you don't provide any artificial egg-laying sites, the eggs will probably be laid in random spots in the bromeliads or in the leaf litter, where they will be very difficult to find. It's actually surprising to me that the frogs actually choose our intended egg-laying sites most of the time, instead of just putting the eggs in the leaf litter or something, but I'm definitely not complaining. For bigger species, such as Olodendrobates species and the bigger Phyllobates species, I recommend using a petri dish or something similar underneath a coconut hut or some other cover. You can buy the coconut huts, but they're also easy to make on your own with a coconut and some tools. The petri dish should be kept humid, maybe with a little bit of water in it, but it shouldn't really have deep water. Whenever you think your frogs have laid some eggs, you can just lift the coconut hut and check. For smaller frogs, such as Ranitomeas and the smaller Ophaga species, I recommend using film canisters. How you should place the film canisters in there depends a bit on the species, and I recommend trying multiple different ones placed at different angles and with different amounts of water inside. For instance, my Ranitomea amazonica prefer to have film canisters that are halfway filled with water and angled roughly 45 degrees upwards, but apparently many other Ranitomeas prefer horizontal ones that are completely dry or just slightly humid on the inside. If you have a lid for the film canisters, you can cut off half the lid and keep the rest on to make the frogs feel more secure, since the opening is a lot smaller. There are also some medium-sized frogs that aren't picky at all and will be happy to use either film canisters or petri dishes. This is the case for my Phyllobates vittatus and my Epipedobates anthonii. You can also experiment with other egg-laying sites for various species, like PVC pipes or various plastic cups. There is nothing magical about film canisters and petri dishes. If you know that your frogs are breeding because you see them carrying tadpoles around, but you can't find any eggs, you can actually just add a water dish or a bunch of water-filled film canisters where the frogs can deposit the tadpoles so you can take them out. Once you have your first eggs, you have already come a long way, and now you have around 2 weeks left until they hatch. I usually take out the eggs immediately when I see them. If they're laid in a petri dish, I just take it out and put a lid on. And if they're laid in a film canister, I try to gently scrape them out into a petri dish using a teaspoon, and the same can be done if they're laid in a bromeliad or in a leaf litter. Sometimes I clean up the eggs with water and a pipette if the petri dish is really dirty, but it's not necessary. The water I use from this point onwards is tadpole tea, and I will show you how to make it in the next segment of the video. Good eggs are transparent, with a yolk that's typically black, but some species also lay white or grey eggs. If the yolk looks cloudy and moldy, then they're definitely bad eggs. You can remove bad eggs from the rest of the clutch if the other eggs look healthy, and this can be done with a razor blade and a pipette. However, there's also a risk that you hurt the other eggs. You can also leave the bad eggs with the good eggs and see what happens, and if you're using tadpole tea, the risk for mold spreading to the good eggs is very limited. For all the species I breed, I keep the water level in the petri dish so deep that the eggs are about halfway covered with water or less, so it's usually only a few millimeters deep. The most important thing is that you generally shouldn't submerge the eggs completely. Some species' eggs can tolerate it though. Now you just have to wait for a while and watch as the tadpoles develop every day inside the eggs. As long as you keep a lid on them, they shouldn't dry out, but keep an eye on them in case you have to add a bit more water. If you're having issues with good eggs turning bad after you've taken them out, try leaving them in the vivarium for the first week or so. Then they get to develop in the environment they were laid in, and the male will regularly return to them with a humid belly to maintain a proper moisture level. Then you can take them out once they're a bit closer to hatching. There are some other causes for getting bad eggs too, which I will talk about in the troubleshooting segment near the end of the video. As I said, the water I use for eggs and tadpoles is so-called tadpole tea. The idea behind tadpole tea is that it has a low pH value, has antibacterial properties, prevents mold, and contains tannins, which color the water so the tadpoles feel more secure. Some species are fine without tadpole tea, but some almost require it. First, you need some decent water to use as the base, such as dechlorinated tap water or spring water. But remember that tap water is very different in different areas and might not be suitable even if you get rid of the chlorine. I personally use my own well water. I would never use distilled or demineralized water for tadpoles, since it doesn't contain all the minerals and ions they need to develop, and it can lead to deficiencies if they can't get access to those minerals somewhere else. It can work in some cases, and I know that some breeders have success with it, but I personally wouldn't use it. Next, you need to add some kind of suitable botanicals that give the water the properties I mentioned earlier. I use cones from the European alder tree, and I'm lucky enough to be able to collect them from my backyard. Many people use Indian almond leaves instead of alder cones, and they can be ordered online, which is very convenient. I boil up some water, add a few alder cones and let it sit overnight to cool down. That's it, easy as that. For the first few days after they've hatched, the tadpoles will appear lifeless for the most part, just lying still absorbing remaining nutrients from the egg. At this point I increase the water level in the petri dish a tiny bit so they can move around more freely, and then I leave them there for a few days until they start to become a bit more active and swim around. Then it's time to move them into the cups or tubs that they will be living in for the rest of the tadpole stage. For the species that are cannibalistic, I set up individual water cups that I fill with tadpole tea and a tiny pinch of living java moss that I just take from one of my vivariums, and then I separate the tadpoles with a spoon. The java moss isn't obligatory, but I have so much of it that I might as well use it. The cups might appear small, but in fact, many dart frogs put their tadpoles in such tiny water sources in the wild too. For the species that aren't cannibalistic, I put them all together in one slightly bigger but still not huge tub, but it's set up in the exact same way with just tadpole tea and moss. Once again, the non-cannibalistic species mainly include Phyllobates and Epipodobates species, and to my surprise I've actually had success raising Ranitmea amazonica like this as well. I've previously used actual plastic cups and various random boxes, but I recently got this rack system where I keep all of my tadpoles now. It takes up way less room, but the main disadvantage is that the tubs are long and shallow instead of being shorter and deeper like plastic cups, so bigger tadpoles will actually splash some water around when you open it. An alternative that a lot of people use with great success is to have a larger communal aquarium or tub that's properly set up with a sponge filter or something along those lines and some aquatic plants. This can even work for some of the species that are cannibalistic, such as the Nerbates species, but occasional aggression is still present and you might still run into some losses and deformities. One of the big advantages with this method is that you won't have to worry as much about the water quality, since it's a bigger system where the water is filtered properly and doesn't get fouled as easily. Many also claim that their tadpoles emerge bigger and stronger or grow faster in these setups compared to when they're raised individually in cups, but that's not something I've noticed, despite trying this method for pretty much all the frog species I breed. I still put some tadpoles in my small aquarium every now and then, but it's not my main method of raising tadpoles at the moment. Dart frog tadpoles are usually fed with some kind of fish food. I can't say that I'm well versed in the world of fish foods, so I recommend doing some research on your own here, but I personally use Tropical Supervit mini granules as my main food source, and I sometimes use Tetramin mini granules and Ben's Jungle's tadpole food, and I've had a lot of success with this mix. A lot of people also use Repashy Soylent Green, which I haven't really looked into using myself, but it's very popular. It's very important to remove uneaten food within a day or so, because leftover food is the largest reason for decreasing water quality. Any leftovers can easily be removed with a pipette. The tadpoles usually won't eat anything for the first few days after they've hatched. It doesn't hurt to give them a bit of food as long as you remove it if it's left uneaten, but I usually wait for 2 or 3 days before even trying. Then I start by feeding them a few grains of the food for each tadpole. Over time, you will gradually increase the amount of food you give them at each feeding, and for bigger species, they're going to become relatively large and eat quite a lot after a while. Each time I feed, I try to feed them so much that they eat all of it within a few hours, but not much more. You will learn that balance eventually. If there's always uneaten food, then you're feeding them a bit too much each time, so feed them slightly less than that. I usually feed around 3 to 4 times every week, but feeding them often and little is usually better than rarely and much. I would say it's generally better to slightly underfeed than to slightly overfeed, since that won't result in any leftover food that will foul the water, but you definitely don't want to significantly underfeed during an extended period of time, as I'm pretty sure that can result in small or poorly growing froglets. Poison dart frog tadpoles are extremely tolerant to bad water quality, and if you're from the aquarium hobby, you will probably be shocked by the disgusting water that they can actually live and develop in. But I still think you should put some effort into keeping the water quality decent instead of trying to push the limits. If you overfeed and don't remove any excess food, the water is going to deteriorate quickly and become cloudy, and over time there will be large amounts of poop collecting in the cup if you keep a large tadpole in a small cup. I usually use a pipette to remove the poop every once in a while, and if the water ever gets cloudy or bubbles appear on the surface, I change 2/3 of the water. You will most likely also have to add more water every now and then, as the water will evaporate. If you're keeping your tadpoles communally in a big, planted, aquarium-like tub, then you won't really have to do water changes or clean it up very often. I've had tadpoles in my aquarium on and off for about 2.5 years, and I've never done a water change. I've only added more water over time. I usually keep my tadpoles in a somewhat bright spot in the room, but not in direct sunlight or with any artificial light. I'm saying this because when I started breeding frogs, I used to have all my tadpole cups in a tub with a grow light on top of it, because I wanted algae to grow in the cups so they could get an extra food source, but the result was just way too much algae in the cups, so I decided to remove the grow light and I haven't gone back to using it ever since. You could probably use some lights if you have a better system for frequent water changes, and perhaps there are some benefits with it, but it's certainly not necessary. I keep all of my tadpoles at room temperature, which varies between 20 and 26 degrees Celsius for me, which is apparently 68 to 79 degrees Fahrenheit. As I've mentioned before, after a while the tadpoles will start growing back legs, which start out small and develop slowly during the course of a few weeks. At the same time, front legs will develop beneath the skin layer and they will eventually just pop out overnight. After that, they will start to absorb their own tail and climb out of the water very soon. The total time the frogs are in the tadpole stage varies a bit from species to species and based on the conditions they're kept under, but most species seem to take around 3 months for me. However, out of the 5 species I've bred, the one that sticks out the most is Epipedobaetis anthonii, whose tadpoles leave the water after only a month and a half. You can stop feeding the tadpoles when the front legs pop out, as they won't eat anything from now on until the tail is completely absorbed. At this point, I usually take the cup and place it straight into the grow out tank I have prepared for them, which I will talk about in a second. I just place the cup straight in there and the froglets have no trouble climbing out of it. I know a lot of people who tilt the cups or even have a paludarium with an inclined plane for them to climb out on, and you can do that if you feel like it, but a healthy tadpole won't have any troubles climbing out of a standing cup. Sometimes they will leave the water within a day or two, still with their tail and everything, and sometimes they will swim around in the water for up to a week and not climb out until the tail is almost completely absorbed. This seems to depend on the species and it's nothing to worry about. For me, my Phyllobaetis and Epipedobaetis species usually climb out immediately, while Dendrobaetis and Ranitomeas tend to take a bit longer. I keep my froglets in vivariums that are 30 by 30 by 30 centimeters or 12 by 12 by 12 inches, or smaller plastic tubs that are around the same size or bigger. And they're set up the exact same way as the vivarium I keep my adult frogs in, except for the fact that they're obviously smaller and don't have a background. They have a proper drainage layer, my normal substrate mix, a cleanup crew and some plants. I usually use more fast growing plants in them compared to my bigger vivariums, since I want there to be enough plant coverage very quickly, so the frogs can feel secure despite the lack of a background. These vivariums are obviously way too small for any adult dart frog, but in my opinion there's nothing wrong with keeping quite a few froglets in them for the first few months of their lives. I usually start with 5 to 10 froglets in each, but if I'm starting with 10, I obviously upgrade them or divide the group into multiple vivariums quite quickly, like within a month or so. The main advantage with keeping frogs like this is that they don't need much maintenance. I usually replant these setups and change the substrate once every year or two to change it up a bit, which is a bit more often than I would for my bigger display vivariums, but I don't do any cleaning aside from that. I just feed, mist, trim the plants and add more leaf litter over time. As I said, I add the froglets straight in there when they leave the water. Many people use even smaller, sterile-ish deli cups with maybe sphagnum moss and a single plant or something to keep a bit more track of the froglet for the first few weeks. And you can absolutely do that, but I personally don't see the need for it. When you immediately introduce them to a proper bioactive setup like I do, it's a bit common for them to quote-unquote disappear into the leaf litter for the first week or so, and it can be a bit anxiety-inducing since you won't see them eat. But I don't worry about that at all, since I know they're pretty much always completely fine in there, and they will start eating when they have to. After all, they have evolved to survive in the wilderness, so a small Exoterra isn't exactly a challenge for them. Most bigger dart frog species can take at least the melanogaster fruit flies, which is a small type, right when they leave the water. But Ranitomea, Ophaga and the Pipidobetes froglets will sometimes need springtails or some other small feeder insects in the beginning. Another common practice that I usually don't do myself is to put old, dying fruit fly cultures in the froglet setups, since they usually contain plenty of mites, and the remaining fruit flies are extra small due to the lack of food during their development phase, so they're the perfect prey for small frogs. It's going to be hard to dust the food until they start eating fruit flies, but the froglets will usually be fine until then, since it doesn't take very long. When you're breeding animals, you will get some random deaths sooner or later and run into some issues with or without an explanation. So I thought I should talk about one of the most common health problems for young froglets, and some of the most common causes for various issues, so you know what to think about. A very common issue when breeding amphibians in captivity is spindly leg syndrome, or SLS for short, which is essentially when the froglet's front legs are extremely thin and weak and can't hold up the weight of the frog. There's no cure for it, and froglets with SLS usually don't make it, but it's preventable to some extent. SLS is quite rare for the hardier species. I've had 2 cases in the 150 froglets I have raised, but as far as I know, with some of the more sensitive species, it's sometimes hard to avoid even for experienced keepers. One thing that's extremely important to prevent or exterminate various issues is to properly supplement the food for the parent frogs. It's usually recommended to store the supplements in the fridge and replace them 6 months after opening them, because the vitamins oxidize and lose their effectiveness over time. The brand you're using also has some impact, since many brands on the market don't contain everything they need in the right proportions. Don't just buy the first thing you find that happens to have the words reptiles and calcium on the cover. The recommendation in the dart frog hobby is usually Repashy Calcium Plus or Dendrocare as all-in-one supplements, but there are several other options out there. So, make sure you have good supplements that aren't expired. Speaking of supplements, bad eggs, spindle leg syndrome and other issues can also derive from a lack of vitamin A. There is vitamin A in the all-in-one supplements, but breeding frogs sometimes need a bit of extra vitamin A. I use Repashy Vitamin A Plus once or twice a month for this reason, and I only give it to my breeding animals and not to my froglets. Many species can successfully be bred without the extra vitamin A, but it's better to prevent an issue than to wait for it to appear. If a certain pair of frogs just keeps producing bad eggs or weak froglets, it could also be because the parent animals are too young or simply a bit exhausted. If that's the case, make them stop breeding for a few months by separating males and females or implementing a dry season so they have time to recover and recharge the batteries to eventually start producing viable offspring again. If there are any issues during or after the tadpole stage, it could also be because of bad water quality. Even though I said that many dart frog tadpoles can develop in freaking disgusting water, that doesn't mean you should push the limits. Make sure to remove any uneaten food quickly, don't overfeed them, and it won't hurt to do partial water changes a bit more frequently if you feel uncertain. You could also try to do a larger communal setup with live plants and a filter, since it's usually easier to maintain good water quality in the bigger setup. Spindle leg syndrome also seems to occur more often in soft water, which is water with a lower amount of calcium in it. As I mentioned earlier, I would avoid using distilled or demineralized water for tadpoles, since it doesn't contain everything the tadpole needs and it can lead to these kinds of problems. There are some species that are fine with it, but it's something you can check if you're having issues. These definitely aren't all the possible causes for various issues, and you won't have a 100% success rate even if you do all these things perfectly, but if there's any issue, I hope you might have some lead as to what could be wrong, and if you're about to start breeding dart frogs, now you know a few things you can do or fix to prevent various issues down the line. If you're not planning on keeping all the froglets for yourself, you can always sell them. Here, I have two things that I want to point out that are easy to forget about. One of them is to consider the minimum age at which froglets can responsibly be sold. I never sell any froglets that are less than 2 months old, and I usually wait even longer nowadays, especially with all of the smaller species, just to make sure that they're well established. Some frogs would most likely be fine moving to a new home in less than 2 months, and I might consider it if it's a hardy species and I know they're going to an experienced keeper, but I would never sell them to some random beginner before that. You will also have to judge that they are a decent size. On a few occasions, I've gotten a froglet that seems a bit smaller than the siblings, and in those cases, I wait a few months extra before selling it to make sure that it's doing well. Remember to also provide proper documentation if you live in a country where it's necessary, since all dart frogs are listed in Appendix 2 in CITES. I live in Sweden, and here you need a breeder certificate proving that they have a legal background, but if you're from some other country, just ask some reliable breeder near you what legislations you have to follow. If you're wondering how to transport dart frogs to their new homes, I have a video about that which you can check out. The link will be in the description down below. Once you're starting out and you've found your first eggs, I highly encourage you to raise them. It's a fun learning experience, and I always appreciate a wide frog market among hobbyists. But if you keep one of the more common and productive species, you will most likely get a lot of eggs after a while, so I recommend you to consider setting some kind of limit for how many eggs you're going to pull so you won't get overwhelmed or flood the market. Taking care of a large number of froglets will require a lot of room and a lot of fruit fly cultures, and I personally think it's a bit unfortunate when people flood the market with high numbers of froglets from a common species and dump the prices, since that usually leads to the frogs going to worse homes in the end. I probably total more than 1,000 eggs a year from all of my frogs combined, but I usually only choose to raise about 10 tadpoles from each of my frog species every year, giving me around 50 froglets a year in total. I don't think I could handle more at the moment, since I have a very limited amount of room and I only sell my frogs on a relatively small national market where the demand isn't that high. That just about wraps it up for my dart frog breeding guide. If you found it helpful, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing the video with a couple of friends. It's completely free and it's a great way for you to support me. As always, please let me know in the comment section if there's anything you feel like I missed or if you have any questions. I read all the comments and it's always interesting to hear about your experiences. If you want to see more of my animal room, check out my Instagram page at gecko_geek06. Thank you so much for watching until the end, and I will see you in the next video.